Brace yourself, we're caught in something. Drayk Voltren gritted his teeth as the Pioneer's edge shuddered violently, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. A surge of force yanked the ship downward, as if invisible hands were dragging them into the abyss. Velocity spiking. Gravity well just deepened. Varek, the navigator, fought the controls, his hands flying over the heads-up displays. Whatever's down there, it's pulling us in like we're stuck in a planetary collapse. Drayk slammed his palm against the armrest of his chair. Reverse thrust. Full burn. Vark Jostin, the engineer, let out a rough exhale. That's not going to cut it. This isn't natural. His knuckles whitened as he rerouted power to the stabilizers. We're caught in something artificial. Gravitational fluctuations aren't random like this. The Pioneer's edge groaned under the strain. The deck beneath them vibrated, a sickening, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat reverberating through steel. Outside the viewport, the rogue planet loomed, its surface veiled in perpetual twilight. And there, half buried in the dense, storm-ravaged terrain, the wreck. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Torn plating, twisted hull, a skeletal silhouette with no clear origin. But Drayk had seen enough dead ships to know when something was pretending to be one. Their onboard AI flickered, displays glitching. An unknown sequence flashed across the laser plasma readouts, a language that shouldn't exist. Oren Tregus, their AI specialist, adjusted his headset, his brow furrowing. Captain, this wreck, its systems are still active. They're not just broadcasting. He stopped. His voice came out lower, unsettled. They're listening. A cold weight settled in Drake's chest. He inhaled sharply through his nose, filtering the recycled air through instinctive caution. Then we shut them up before they decide to talk back. He motioned to Dane Corliss, their weapons expert, who was already syncing up the ship's pulse cannons. Firing a warning shot, Dane muttered, running his fingers over the trigger interface. The Pioneer's edge discharged a controlled blast, just enough to rattle debris loose. The wreck didn't react. No movement, no shields, just silence. Then, the shipboard lights dimmed. "Power drain! Systems flickering!" Oren barked. "It's pulling something from us!" Torin swore under his breath. "Captain, our thrusters aren't responding. It's got a grip on our sublight engines." A deep, reverberating thud sounded through the hull. Not from an impact, not from turbulence, from inside their ship. Drayk shot up from his chair. "Boarding teams, now!" Dane grabbed his rifle, jaw tight. Whatever's in that thing just invited itself in. They moved fast, slipping into combat gear as emergency klaxons bathed the corridors in rotating red light. Oren jogged beside Drayk, his HUD flickering erratic system alerts. "Captain, we never even established a link. The wreck, it accessed us before we could access it. I don't even think it's using standard frequencies." Drake's pulse steadied. A calculated coldness settled over his thoughts. Then it's been waiting for something to talk to. They reached the primary junction. The air was wrong, thicker, charged with an unseen force. The walls, once smooth titanium alloy, now bore hairline fractures spreading outward in unnatural symmetry. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A tremor. Not sound, but a sensation crawling through their bones. Dane held up a fist, signaling the team to stop. He adjusted his visor's thermal readout. There's movement ahead. They rounded the next corner. And there it was. A lattice of shifting matter, not liquid, not solid, but oscillating between both states, anchored to their corridor bulkheads. It pulsed as if breathing, sending undulating ripples through its structure. Vark muttered, barely audible. "That's some kind of lattice composite. No way that's just dead wreckage." Oren swallowed hard. "That's not from our ship." Drayk stepped forward, rifle raised. "Contain it, now!" Dane fired first. The round struck true, but instead of dissipating on impact, the structure absorbed the kinetic force. The rippling matter contracted, then unfurled, elongating outward, reaching for them. "Fall back!" A surge of energy snapped through the corridor, sending sparks cascading. The Pioneer's edge trembled beneath their feet. Torin's voice came through comms, strained. "Captain, We're accelerating downward. It's pulling us in faster. Drayk gritted his teeth. Vark, reroute auxiliary thrust. Get us free now. The engineer's voice came back tight. Not an option. This thing's interfaced with our systems. We don't even have full control anymore. Another jolt rattled the ship. Dane fired again, but the lattice responded instantly, eating the projectile's energy like a predator devouring its prey. A sudden realization burned through Drake's mind. This wasn't some random distress beacon. This wasn't just old debris drifting through space. This thing, whatever it was designed to adapt, and now it was learning. Oren's voice cut in, breathless. I just decrypted a partial sequence. Captain, it's not a distress signal. A pause. It's an activation sequence. Drake's pulse pounded in his skull. They weren't salvaging a wreck. They were waking something up. A new sound filled the corridor, a low, shifting frequency, like an ancient machine stirring from a long slumber. The lattice began moving faster, tendrils weaving into the bulkheads, the walls reshaping, folding into themselves. And then the lights died completely. Only the HUDs and emergency strobes remained. In that flickering illumination, the lattice writhed, expanding, spreading. Drake's voice was ice. Vark, tell me we still have weapons control. Silence. Then, it's in our targeting systems. We can't fire without hitting our own damn ship. Torin's frantic voice cut in. Something just pulsed out from the wreck. Captain, we've been scanned. A deep shuddering groan rippled through the hull, not from stress, not from impact, from something shifting. Oren's breath hitched. It's adapting again. Captain, it's going to rewrite our ship into itself. Drake's grip tightened around his rifle. He had led missions into the unknown before. He had fought when the odds were impossible. But this wasn't war. This was something older, smarter, hungrier, and it had just decided they belonged to it now. The darkness pressed in, thick and shifting, alive with movement the human eye struggled to track. Pioneer's edge wasn't just losing power. It was being rewritten, its systems unraveling, reshaped by the lattice of unknown matter crawling through the corridors. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural stillness, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Drayk Voltren kept his rifle aimed ahead, but every instinct screamed that bullets wouldn't matter against something that did not break, only changed. The emergency strobes flickered, throwing erratic shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The lattice spread with terrifying fluidity, its tendrils moving in slow, deliberate undulations like deep-sea predators sensing a pulse in the water. Oren Tregus adjusted his visor's display, his fingers tense over his wrist console. Captain, whatever that scan did, it wasn't passive. It's processing us, mapping, learning. Then we make sure it learns the wrong thing, Drake muttered, shifting his stance. Vark, what's our status on propulsion? Vark Jostin's voice cut through the open channel, tight with controlled urgency. Sublights locked. That thing has its claws in our primary drive. If we don't break free soon, we won't have a ship left to fight for. Torin Virek's voice followed, quieter, but no less sharp. Captain, our orbit's decaying faster than before. We're not just being held, we're being pulled in. Drake's stomach clenched. The wreck wasn't an isolated threat. It was anchoring them, dragging them down to the rogue planet's surface. If they hit atmosphere with no control, they'd burn before they ever hit the ground. The lattice twitched. It had heard them. Oren stiffened, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain, I think it... A shockwave tore through the corridor. The air contracted as though space itself had been sucked from the room. The lattice surged forward, not blindly, not randomly, but with purpose. Move! Dane Corliss fired rapid bursts of concentrated plasma. Each shot struck home, but the lattice absorbed the heat, the kinetic force, the energy itself, its structure rippling as if tasting something new. The corridor shrank around them, walls closing in as the lattice thickened. They ran, boots pounding against the deck, breath ragged in the stale, recycled air. Drake's mind raced. They couldn't fight this thing conventionally. It wasn't playing by the same rules. Torin, reroute helm control to manual backups, he snapped through the comm. We need thrusters. Any thrusters? Now. Torin's reply came with static. Trying, but this thing's bleeding into every system. It's like a new voice cut through the channel. Not human, not synthetic. A collection of frequencies layered atop one another, fluctuating too rapidly for the brain to process fully. Not spoken, not transmitted, but felt. A vibration deep in the bones, threading through the marrow. Oren jerked as though something had yanked him backward. "It's inside!" His voice fractured, distorted. The heads-up display on his visor glitched violently, data feeds unraveling into cascading symbols. Drayk grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. "Oren, stay with me!" The lattice twitched in response. Oren shuddered, blinking rapidly. The display on his visor steadied, but his skin was slick with cold sweat. "It tried to sync with me," he rasped. Not a message, not a warning, a command. Drake's grip tightened. "What did it say?" Oren's throat bobbed. "Assimilate." A second pulse rattled the ship, sending a metallic groan through the deck plating. The lattice was no longer spreading at random. It was growing towards something. Dane exhaled sharply. "Captain, look at the walls." At first it just looked like more lattice growth, but the longer Drake stared, the clearer it became. Patterns, intricate, methodical, almost deliberate. They weren't just random formations. They were designs. Torren's voice crackled in the comms. "Captain, the wreck just changed its signal frequency. Our long-range comms are completely down." "They weren't already," Vark growled. "No, I mean they're gone, like rewritten." A pause. Then, "Captain, our distress beacon is now transmitting." Drake froze. Dine's hands curled into fists. "That's not our distress call, is it?" "No," Oren said, staring at the shifting lattice. "It's sending something else." The wreck wasn't just scanning them. It was using them. Torren's voice came back, barely audible. "Captain, we're not alone." Outside the viewport, the rogue planet's upper atmosphere rippled. Not storm clouds, not gas shifts. Movement. At first it seemed like debris. Then the realization settled like lead in Drake's gut. They weren't the first ship caught in this thing's grip. Fragments of vessels, twisted, reshaped, wove through the wreck's structure, half consumed, half rebuilt. A graveyard of ships that had never sent their distress signals back home. And something else. Not wreckage, not debris. Something moving. Oren's hands hovered over his interface, his expression carved from stone. "Captain, that thing just sent out a transmission. Encrypted." Dane's jaw tensed. "Tell me it's not coordinates." Oren swallowed hard. "It's coordinates." Drake's spine went rigid. "Where?" Oren exhaled, slow and shaky. "Deep space, outside the patrol routes. Nothing charted there." A beat of silence. Vark broke it. Voice taut. "It's calling something, isn't it?" Drake turned, meeting each of their eyes. He saw what they weren't saying aloud. This wasn't salvage anymore. This was a battlefield. He activated the ship-wide communication. "All crew, emergency lockdown. Manual override, full system isolation. We sever this thing from our ship, or we're dead where we stand." Torren's voice was already moving ahead. "If it's latched onto our engines, we can burn hard in a random direction. Rip free before it can compensate." Dane adjusted his rifle. "And if we can't?" Drake's stare was steel. "Then we make sure it doesn't live long enough to care." The ship trembled again, but this time it wasn't from the wreck. It was them. Breaking orbit. Fighting to tear free before the thing dragging them down learned how to hold them forever. The ship shuddered, twisting through turbulence that shouldn't exist in open space. Pioneer's Edge surged forward, its thrusters screaming as Torren yanked manual controls, forcing the vessel into a breakneck course correction. The force crushed Drake against his seat restraints. He gritted his teeth as inertia tried to rip him sideways. "We're pulling free." Torren's voice cut short. The heads-up display flashed warnings. Proximity alert. Incoming gravitational anomaly. The wreck was retaliating. Drake's eyes snapped to the viewport. The rogue planet's atmosphere churned beneath them, streaked with the artificial glow of shifting gravitational pockets, unstable distortions caused by whatever the wreck was generating. Oren's hands flew over his console, rerouting data feeds. The wreck's creating an inversion field. Gravity's folding back on itself. It's turning space into a kill box. Dane rechecked his weapon's charge. That means if we don't find a way out of this gravity trap, we're going to be smeared across 20 kilometers of rock. Vark's voice cut in. We need a boost. Something that'll throw us clear before we're dragged into another dead zone. Drayk locked eyes with Torin. You still got a direct line to the reactor? Torin's hands clenched around the control sticks. Yeah, but that kind of push will burn out our secondary stabilizers. Do it. The deck lurched as Torin slammed the override. The ship's reactor surged. A concentrated energy burst, ejecting them forward. The structural reinforcements groaned as the Pioneer's edge ripped free from the gravity well like a bullet tearing through water. Drayk exhaled. They weren't safe, but they had distance. Orin's screen flickered with something worse. Captain, that transmission? He hesitated. We're not the only ones who picked it up. The comms flared to life. UEF Sentinel, a United Earth Fleet patrol ship. A firm, no-nonsense voice filled the bridge. This is Commander Quenveros. We received your distress beacon. Identify yourselves. Dane's fingers tightened on his rifle. That's not our distress call. Varsa's voice hardened. Then who the hell sent it? Drayk inhaled slowly. Patch them through. The screen shifted. The Sentinel loomed ahead, flanked by 2 escort-class warships, their hulls lined with plasma strike batteries and electronic warfare suites. Their sensors were locked onto Pioneer's edge, tracking them like a wounded animal. Varos's face appeared, sharp-eyed and assessing. Captain Voltren, your ship's transmitting classified frequencies linked to restricted war-era technology. Drake's spine went rigid. We didn't send that signal. We encountered a wreck, a ship buried near the rogue planet. It hacked our systems before we could cut the connection. Varos's jaw twitched. A wreck. You're telling me some old broken-down ship hijacked your distress beacon? Dane scoffed. You think we made this up? That thing dug into our systems before we even touched it. Orin's hands flew across his console. Commander, you need to listen. That wreck isn't just transmitting, it's waiting. And if you're here, you've already triggered whatever it was hoping to reach. A pause. Then, clarify. Orin adjusted the display, overlaying the transmission data. It's not just a signal, it's a handshake, a beacon built to respond to specific technology, and your ship's just answered it. A warning siren flared across the Sentinel. Varos's screen flickered. Hold position. A distortion wave rippled through space. Drayk turned sharply to the viewport. The wreck had moved. It hadn't drifted. It hadn't been dragged by gravity. It had shifted, a deliberate, unnatural correction in space-time. Vark swore. It's reacting to them. Orin paled. No, it's pulling them in. The Sentinel's thrusters flared, fighting against an unseen force. But the wreck didn't need weapons. It was manipulating physics itself. Varos's voice snapped over the comms. We are registering unknown gravitational distortions. It's locking onto us. The wreck pulsed. The Sentinel's shields flickered. The escort ships twisted against their own propulsion systems, their stabilizers failing. Drake's blood turned cold. The wreck wasn't trying to destroy them. It was dissecting them, breaking them apart, pulling their shipboard AIs, their power signatures, their drive cores, learning their configurations before choosing what to keep. A deep thrum rattled through space, not sound, not vibration, but something deeper. A pulse of knowledge, of understanding, and then the Sentinel's main drive collapsed inward. The ship fractured at its center as its structural integrity failed, not from attack, not from external pressure, but because something had decided it didn't need to exist in that form anymore. It wasn't destruction, it was reconstruction. A shape unfolded where the warship had been, not a wreck, not human, something new. Dane's voice was a whisper. It just used them. Varus's image on the comm froze. A second later, the screen shattered into static. Torin's voice cut through the silence. Captain, we need to move. Drake's pulse slammed in his ears. They weren't in a battle. They were in an experiment. Orin's data streams flickered erratically. Captain, the wreck, it's rewriting itself. The lattice had spread. It wasn't just absorbing ships, it was incorporating them. The Sentinel's remains folded into its structure, merging seamlessly, reconfiguring as though it had always been part of the design. A new signal pulsed through the wreck's exterior, analyzing, searching. Torren's grip tightened on the controls. "Captain, it's looking for something else." Drake's throat went dry. He already knew the answer. It was looking for them. He turned sharply. "Vark, reroute auxiliary thrusters. Get us out of range." "Already on it." Dane rechecked his rifle. "And if we can't?" Drake's stare was cold. "Then we stop letting it dictate the rules." The ship rattled as their thrusters fired, burning hard toward deep space. The wreck remained still, watching, waiting. Then it moved, not chasing, not attacking. It was going somewhere. Orrin's fingers hovered over his console. "Captain, I think it's leaving." Drake's jaw clenched. "Leaving for what?" Orrin's throat bobbed. "The transmission." His voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just a signal. Drake felt the weight of the words before they were even spoken. It was a summons. The wreck was no longer waiting. It had been answered. The wreck was moving. Not drifting, not spiraling, moving with intent. Torren's hands clenched the controls as the Pioneer's edge burned hard away from the battlefield. The ship's frame trembled under the strain, but the crew barely noticed. Their eyes were fixed on the monstrosity unfolding in front of them. Orrin's knuckles turned white as he ran another system check. "Captain, the data from the wreck's transmission just updated. It's not broadcasting anymore." Drake felt something cold settle in his chest, because it got its response. A second pulse tore through space. Not an explosion, not a shockwave. Something deeper. A distortion. Vark's fingers flew over the controls. "Tracking gravitational signatures. Captain, we have incoming." Drake exhaled sharply. It wasn't summoning one thing. It was summoning many. The heads-up display flickered, marking new entries. Multiple gravity wells flickering in and out of phase, each appearing like a tear in the very fabric of space. Dane was already strapping in, adjusting his rifle. "Tell me those aren't what I think they are." Orrin's screen updated. The wreck had company. Vessels, if they could still be called that, began emerging from the distortions. They weren't ships in any conventional sense. Their forms warped mid-flight, shifting between configurations as if rewriting themselves based on what the wreck had learned. Some bore faint traces of old military hulls, but the shapes were barely recognizable. Half-grown constructs, shifting alloys interwoven with crystalline lattice, it had been calling its kind. Torren swore under his breath. "Those things aren't warships. They're experiments." Drake's stomach twisted. They had barely survived the first encounter. Now the battlefield was filling with them. The comms flared back to life. The Sentinel's escorts, the last two UEF warships, had repositioned. Commander Varos's fleet was gone, but the remaining ships were rallying. "Pioneer's Edge, this is UEF Valak." The voice was tight, the urgency unmistakable. "We are reading unknown hostiles, engaging defensive protocols." Defensive protocols. Drake almost laughed. The wreck didn't fight conventionally. Anything they threw at it, it would absorb, adapt, and repurpose. He switched the channel. "Valak, disengage. You don't have the weapons to fight this thing." The reply was static at first. Then, "We're not leaving this battlefield, Captain." Drake understood. They wouldn't abandon a fight, but this wasn't a fight. This was a feeding ground. The first UEF strike tore through space, a plasma salvo lined with ion disruptors. The energy screamed through the wreckage, colliding with the incoming ships. And then, the impossible happened. The plasma should have burned through, should have left devastation. Instead, the wreck's surface split apart, absorbing the impact like a wound closing over. The energy spread through its structure, its hull twisting, bending, growing in response. Dane's voice was tight. "It just ate a direct hit." The wreck pulsed. A moment later, the attack was sent back. A distorted echo of the same strike erupted from the wreck's shifting frame. The plasma bolts it absorbed, reconfigured, amplified, and shot back at the UEF fleet with twice the force. The Valak's forward shields buckled, its hull plates rippled, bending unnaturally before the energy burned through its core. The ship split apart, not destroyed, but reshaped, converted into something else before it had a chance to die. Drayk clenched his jaw. This isn't a battle. This is a test run. The wreck wasn't just adapting, it was improving. Oren's data feeds flickered with new readings. It's using quantum lattice restructuring at an accelerating rate. Every single thing it absorbs, it's integrating into itself. That's why it's targeting ships. Drayk turned to Vark. How much thrust do we have left? Vark ran calculations, sweat beating at his temple. Enough for a short burn, but no jumps. We lost long-range propulsion the second that thing hijacked our systems. Drayk forced down the frustration boiling in his gut. No retreat, no reinforcements. They were in this until the last ship fell, or they found a way to shut this down. He turned to Oren. The wreck's still following a sequence, right? Everything it's doing, every move, it's based on something. Oren exhaled. Yes, but it's rewriting its own programming. There's no single command structure. It doesn't think like an AI. It thinks like... His words trailed off. Drayk narrowed his eyes. Like what? Oren hesitated. Like it's looking for something. As if the destruction isn't the point. It's a means to an end. Drake's mind sharpened. Then we stop it before it finds what it's looking for. Torin glanced over his shoulder. We don't even know what that is. Drake's stare was steady. We know it's using our technology against us. We know it adapts to what it consumes. That means it's still operating under rules, even if they aren't ones we understand. Vark's expression darkened. Are you suggesting we give it something it can't adapt to? Drayk nodded. Dane exhaled. And what the hell would that be? Silence filled the bridge for a beat. Then Oren looked up from his console. His face was pale. Corrupted data. Drayk turned toward him. Explain. Oren's fingers flew over the display, pulling up raw code from the wreck's transmission. It's absorbing structured data from everything it touches. It can adapt because it's learning. But what if we fed it something incomplete? Torin frowned. You want to give it a virus? Oren shook his head. Not a virus. That's too predictable. It would fight back. But what if we made it fight itself? Drake's mind locked onto the idea. A paradox. Oren continued, urgency creeping into his voice. If we can introduce conflicting directives, make it recognize two separate versions of its own core function, then maybe, just maybe, it'll try to process both at once. Vark leaned forward. And if it does, Oren's throat bobbed. It could collapse its own structure trying to compensate. Drayk didn't waste another second. Then we find a way to do it. Torin was already moving. We'd need a controlled transmission, something we can deploy fast enough that it doesn't stop us first. Dane flexed his grip on his rifle. And how do we even get close enough? Drayk exhaled. We don't. We make it come to us. He turned to Oren. Can you send an artificial distress call, one that mimics the wreck's own transmissions? Oren's eyes widened as he understood. You want to bait it? Drayk nodded. It's been pulling ships in to study them. Let's give it something worth studying. Vark exhaled. That means we need to let it latch onto us again. Drayk set his jaw. Then we make sure it grabs the wrong thing. The wreck wasn't just a predator. It was a machine looking for the next step in its evolution. They were about to give it a dead end. The wreck loomed, shifting like a living shadow against the void. Where the Sentinel once stood, only twisted fragments remained, fused into the monstrous lattice that continued to evolve, pulsating with stolen knowledge. It wasn't just consuming. It was designing something new, something that should never exist, and they were about to make sure it never would. Drayk Voltren stood rigid at the bridge of the Pioneer's edge, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Oren, how long until you can get the corrupted data loaded? Oren's fingers flew across his station. I can have it ready in 3 minutes, but we're talking about making this thing break itself. If it recognizes what we're doing before the loop, fully integrates, it could purge the error. Drake's jaw flexed. Then we don't give it time to think. He turned to Vark. How much power can we push into the transmission? Vark's expression was grim. If I disable every non-essential system and dump everything into the comm array, we can force the upload instead of just embedding it. But that'll put us in the dark. No weapons, no thrusters. We'd be dead weight. Drake exhaled through his nose. They wouldn't need weapons if this worked. They wouldn't need thrusters if it didn't. Dane adjusted his rifle strap, glancing at the viewport. That thing still hasn't finished whatever it's building. You think we're on a clock? We've been on a clock since the moment we answered that signal. Drake looked back at Oren. When you trigger the upload, what happens first? If we do it right. Oren's eyes flickered with cold determination. It won't recognize the contradiction immediately. It'll start resolving the corrupted commands instead of rejecting them. It'll try to process both conflicting instructions at once, expansion and shutdown, until its own structure collapses trying to make sense of itself. Drake nodded. That was all he needed to hear. Torin, bring us closer. The navigator hesitated. You want to close the distance? We need it to think it's still controlling the board, Drake said evenly. If we run, we look like a threat. If we let it believe we're still caught in its game, it won't defend itself until it's too late. Torin muttered something under his breath but obeyed. The Pioneer's Edge adjusted course, drifting toward the wreck's gravitational field, drawing into its pull like another piece of prey, waiting to be stripped apart. Oren's screen flashed as the corrupted data finalized. Upload's ready. Drake stepped forward. Do it. The ship's comm array pulsed. For a moment, nothing changed. The wreck remained still, its structure continuing to shift and adapt, analyzing the stolen materials it had gathered. Then the first flicker of hesitation. Oren whispered, It's trying to process the loop. The wreck quivered. Tendrils of quantum lattice stilled, losing their fluidity. The ship's eerie glow fluctuated, the patterns that had once moved with unnatural grace staggering, halting. Then came the first error pulse. A distortion wave rippled outward, violent, unstructured, as if the wreck itself had gasped. Its hull folded inward for a fraction of a second like a muscle seizing in response to a wound. Dane watched the readings, eyes narrowing. How long before it figures out what's happening? Oren swallowed. Depends on how much of itself it's already rewritten. If the core logic is too far gone, it'll collapse before it can stabilize. A second pulse. The lattice fractured along the edges, the seamless shifts now jagged, erratic. Torin's hands twitched over the controls. Captain, it's coming apart. The wreck shuddered. A third pulse, but not an attack. A distress signal. Oren's face turned white. It's calling for help. Drake's stomach tightened. Cut the transmission, now! Oren moved instantly, killing the connection before the wreck could pass along the corrupted sequence to whatever else might be listening. The wreck convulsed. Entire sections of its lattice split from its body, breaking apart like fracturing ice. Its glow flickered wildly, a dying light caught between ignition and extinction. And then, a final deafening collapse. The wreck imploded, folding into itself with a force that sent gravitational distortions rippling outward. Drake felt his breath hitch. They had done it. But as the last remnants of the structure twisted inward, dissolving into its own paradox, something else appeared on Oren's screen. Another signal, weaker, distant, still out there. Oren's voice was barely above a whisper. Captain. That wasn't the only one. Dane exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his rifle. Figures. Vark's screen flickered, relaying long-range scans. Whatever's left of that thing, it won't be sending any more messages. But if there are others... Drake stared at the empty space where the wreck had once been. No remains, no salvage, just a void where something impossible had nearly rewritten the laws of existence. He exhaled slowly. We don't tell UEF Command what we found here. Torin looked up, brows furrowed. Are you serious? Drake turned, facing his crew. If we report this, the UEF will send research teams. They'll try to study it, try to understand it. His eyes darkened. And the next time one of these things sends a signal, they won't fight it. They'll answer. Orin nodded, silent understanding passing between them. We erase all logs of our findings. Drayk met each of their eyes. This wreck tried to change what we are. But humans, we don't break the way it expected. We fight, we learn, and we burn down anything that thinks it can reshape us into something lesser. A moment of silence. Then Dane let out a rough chuckle. So what do we tell UEF Command? Drayk turned back toward the viewport, watching the last distortions fade. That the Pioneer's Edge found a ghost ship full of nothing but wreckage, Torrin smirked. And what do we call the damn thing? Drake's lips curled into a cold smile. The junk ship that became a galactic horror,